The International Court of Justice will begin deliberations on South Africa's genocide case against Israel. The court is expected to rule on possible emergency measures later this month, but a ruling on the genocide allegations will only follow later as they get into the merits of the case. Israel today defended itself, arguing that it has a right to do so under international law. South Africa yesterday formally accused it of subjecting Palestinians in Gaza to acts of genocide. The 8-member legal team told the court that the latest war is part of decades of Israeli oppression of Palestinians. South Africa is seeking preliminary orders to compel Israel to stop its military campaign in Gaza. The legal advisor of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Tal Becker, says South Africa has put forward a profoundly distorted factual and legal picture before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He says South Africa is ignorant of Palestine's responsibility, and wants to erase Jewish history.
On Saturday, October 7th, a Jewish religious holiday, thousands of Hamas and other militants breached Israeli sovereign territory by sea, land and air, invading over 20 Israeli communities, bases and the site of a music festival. What proceeded, under the cover of thousands of rockets fired indiscriminately into Israel, was the wholesale massacre, mutilation, rape and abduction of as many citizens as the terrorists could find before Israel's forces repelled them.
Dr. Becker suggests South Africa's case against Israel has ignored events which led to the ongoing conflict. He says Hamas committed a wholesale massacre and that Israel is simply defending itself.
The events of that day are all but ignored in the applicant's submissions. But we are compelled to share with the court some fraction of its horror. The largest calculated mass murder of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. We do so not because these acts, however sadistic and systematic, release Israel of its obligations to uphold the law as it defends its citizens and territory.
Israel has accused South Africa of maintaining close ties with Hamas, despite the group being recognized as a terrorist organization by a number of countries, including them.
South Africa has long hosted and celebrated its ties with Hamas figures, including a senior Hamas delegation that, incredibly, visited the country for a, quote, solidarity gathering just weeks after the massacre. In justifying instituting proceedings, South Africa makes much of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. It seems fitting, then, that it be instructed to comply with those obligations itself, to end its own language of delegitimization of Israel's existence, end its support for Hamas.
Let's speak more on this with Daniel Levy. He's a political scientist and head of U.S. Middle East Project, as well as Professor Cathleen Powell, Associate Professor of Public Law at the University of Cape Town. Big thank you to both our guests. Mr. Levy, sir, let's start with you, perhaps, and you can tell us what it is that, in terms of immediate reaction, that people from Israel are saying, because we heard from Professor Malcolm Shaw arguing that on the 7th of October 2023, attacks by Hamas and atrocities that were committed constitute the true context for South Africa's allegations of genocide against Israel. The main argument essentially being that Israel is the true victim of genocide here. What has the discussion been like on the platform that you are on?
Well, I think that the argument that was heard today by the Israeli team was perhaps at its weakest when it was trying to shift and take Israel out of the dock of the accused and put South Africa in the dock, or even Hamas in that position. So I think you did not get a robust rebuttal of the evidence that was placed before the court yesterday in terms of the horrors of what is going on in Gaza, in terms of Israel's responsibility for those. I think on a moral probably factual, historical plane, Israel has lost already in that respect. I would also suggest, and this is in terms of the debate inside Israel, that it's fascinating that the Israeli team had to lean very heavily on the Israeli legal system and its capacities, and that system has been under assault by the Israeli government for the last year. And I think there was a little bit of a political internal game, perhaps, going on there on the Israeli side. And thirdly, and very importantly, a lot of what you heard from the Israeli defense are actually things, statements, cooperation on humanitarian provision that Israel has put in place only subsequent to the South African submission to the International Court of Justice. In other words, I think this shows how seriously this has been taken, and that we may well see that many lives even have been saved because Israel felt it had to respond in the court of law to a very serious accusation. Now, having said all of that, where does this come out legally? Because I've related here to the strength of the case on a moral level, on a factual, on a historical level of the situation between Israelis and Palestinians. The arguments that Israel were making, which leaned heavily into the judicial purview of the court on this, which leaned heavily into the question of, is there indeed a dispute? Should this be before the court? Is there a dispute that merits the court ruling between Israel and South Africa? And I think most crucially, because I think this is where everything zooms in this first round, which is it appropriate for provisional measures to be issued by the court? On those legal questions, I think it is far too early to tell. And thankfully, we have Professor Powell with us, who's far better placed to make that designation. I would just say this, that I do think that when Israel tried to rebut the broader historical case of the circumstances in Gaza, of the overall framing of an apartheid reality, that they did not do a good job in doing so. In that respect, and I think South Africa has put something really important in the frame, and this I'm hearing from Israelis, which is that international law matters.
Yeah. In comes Professor Powell. Prof, thank you very much for your time. Perhaps we can start with this, the Genocide Convention, and you can remind our viewers how it came to be, because we heard from Israel arguing that genocide stands alone in international law as the zenith of evil and wickedness. It contended that if claims of genocide were to become common currency of armed conflict whenever and wherever that occurred, the essence of this crime will be diluted and lost, given this moment.
All right. The Genocide Convention did arise out of the Holocaust. It arose out of the Nazi genocide of Jews in the Third Reich. So from that point of view, Israel has a very intimate connection with the Genocide Convention. Unfortunately, genocide didn't stop there. We've had Bosnia-Herzegovina, we've had Myanmar, we've had Rwanda. Much as they have, Israel may have a specific relationship with the convention, it's not a monopoly. What happens legally if you work out whether there's genocide is you check what the requirements for genocide are. In effect, you draw up a little checklist, and then you see whether those requirements are met. And what you need to prove you've got genocide is firstly a range of acts that are considered genocidal, which will include killing members of the group, severely wounding members of the group, making conditions of life impossible for that group, preventing births within the group. Those were the 4 that South Africa focused on. But it needs to be accompanied by a specific genocidal intent. And this is the thing that makes genocide such a particular special crime. And the intent that has to be proven is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, religious, racial, or ethnical group. So what South Africa had to do yesterday was to show that there's a prima facie case that Israel is doing just that. And what it did was it set out the acts that have been occurring in in Gaza over the past 3 months, acts which today Israel described as purely self-defense measures. And then it added to that 18 pages of comments made by members of the Israeli government, people connected to the Israeli government, soldiers, singers even, that indicated a willingness or indeed a desire to wipe Gaza off the map. And there was a reference to the seed of Amalek, which was an ethnic group destroyed by the Jews under Saul during the Bible. And the Amalekites were destroyed, man, woman, children, and animals. Benjamin Netanyahu has referred to that. Soldiers have referred to the Amalekites when they sing sort of in celebration. So the case made, this particular point was argued by Tembeka Mukatobi, was very strong, that there is in fact genocidal intent.
Prof,
so that's genocide.
Yeah. Well, Israel will disagree with you because today we heard them argue that there is no prima facie case. In fact, on the genocide intent, as argued by advocate Mugai Tobi, he focused on the language used, right? And on the Amalek reference, we heard from the Israelis saying there's no need for theological discussion on this. That statement was misleadingly quoted. They've gone on to tear that apart, saying that random quotes were used that do not represent government policy, that the language used by Israeli officials was rhetorical and cannot be seen as calling for genocide, that in fact they are the victims of genocide. And so what will it take to convince the court who is right here between the two parties?
Well, this is why we have a court of law, and I'm glad the issue is before a court of law, because it's going to have to analyze how seriously to take each of those statements. I must say my immediate response when Counsel for Israel said, well, these are just rhetorical statements, was to think of Trump's claim that assaulting women is okay with just locker room talk. No matter how rhetorical a statement is, if it's a statement being shared widely and encouraged by the actual government, it's a statement that can lead to genocide. I mean, we saw that in Rwanda. Dehumanizing language is very, very dangerous. In fact, taking those statements seriously shows we're taking the Genocide Convention seriously. We're not cheapening it. So, look, the ICJ will decide, but I found the attempt to kind of wipe away those 18 pages worth of statements thin and a little bit, almost a little bit insulting. And you don't need to be a theologian to know what the story of Amalek was. It's just a historical issue. You know who was killed in that case, and that is what Benjamin Netanyahu and others have been referencing.
Mr. Levy, sir, we also heard that Israel, one Ms. Galit Raguan painted a reality on the ground, and she painted 3 scenarios. The first, Hamas and military tactics and strategy, like you rightfully mentioned, that Israel put South Africa and Hamas in the dock here, saying that, well, they misfired 2,000 rockets in some instances. They showed pictures, a number of pictures. I'm not sure what you understand of those pictures, claiming to be what Hamas has allegedly done in terms of misfiring the rockets or in terms of hiding weapons, for instance, in incubators. At some point, we saw a picture of an alleged child's room where weapons were hidden underneath a bed. What did you see? What were you looking at? We couldn't make out clearly what it is that we were shown and that evidence and the veracity of it.
Well, first of all, I got the impression that Israel made a decision not to use as much footage as it had maybe planned to do so, because I think the South African team yesterday actually preempted what they anticipated to be a little more of a circus of imagery that Israel was going to share. And I get the impression they course corrected and decided this might not go down so well. Look, in terms of what they did show, I don't think that is going to be very convincing, that this level of destruction of civilian death, 85% displaced. In fact, at one stage they said, we're being terribly humanitarian by asking people to move. We're realizing our obligation under the law. Hey, that doesn't apply when 85% of the population are now displaced, and you're bombing the places that you've told them to move to. But more crucially here, I think, is this extremely powerful body of evidence across, and this is in mainstream Western media, and it's well documented, the nature of the weaponry. These extremely powerful bombs, not used since the Second World War, never used, ever, historically, anywhere in such a densely packed civilian population area. So I don't think that's going to stack up well. Now, of course, Hamas committed crimes. The attempt to suggest that South Africa ignored that is not correct. What was here being tested is whether provisional measures, because of irreparable harm and prejudice, need to be ordered by the court under the Genocide Convention. And Israel, of course, if it believes that it is threatened by genocide, has every right to go to that court and to make that claim against Hamas. It doesn't. It hasn't. That is actually the crimes committed by Hamas will be and are being investigated by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, just as they're investigating the crimes committed by Israel. I think I agree with Professor Powell here that I don't think they had a good answer to all the incitement of the statements. The idea that what they went after, for instance, was the statement of a junior minister saying, hey, he doesn't have any importance whatsoever. And then what they ended up quoting in great length, and it's incredibly transparent and almost embarrassingly so, the thing that they quoted in most length was a statement by the Israeli Prime Minister from 2 days ago. Now, anyone who doesn't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu made that statement so it could be quoted 2 days later at the court, I'm afraid was born yesterday. So I don't think that was so effective. Unfortunately, and some of the legal arguments were well made. I think we absolutely should recognize that. I think a lot of it was insincere and cynical and disingenuous, especially we're making every effort, we're doing so many humanitarian things. That, I think, those who did watch yesterday and watch today and follow this closely, I don't think are going to be convinced. But if I can close just by noting what you said earlier on and something that Professor Powell said that really struck me, which is, of course, Israel, after the Holocaust, where the Genocide Convention came from, this special relationship, but not a monopoly. And I think one of the hardest things following this for the last 2 days and following everything that has happened is the tragic irony that you see Israel accused of committing these crimes, committing many of these crimes, and I just don't think it's a good place for Israel to even be suggesting that there should be an exceptionalism in play here, and that is what they seem to be suggesting. Now, it may well be that the South African appeal does not achieve everything it wanted. It could even be decided that this is not justiciable. There's no actual dispute. But I think by putting this on the table, this has been very important indeed in terms of the conversation that's taking place. And that's something that we will be left with, whatever the outcome. And look, you have a set of judges. You have an American chair. Just happens to be the case. Some of the judges are shifting soon. I don't know if they'll still be around to make the final judgment. I think there will be a predisposition amongst many of the judges to see this, especially through the lens of, well, this is a terrorist organization against a state trying to act in its legitimate self-defense. That could influence things, understandably, but also how much will they have that historical context? Will they take that into account, the understanding of how Israel has operated over decades vis-a-vis the Palestinians? And we will have to wait and see. As Professor Powell says, that's why you have a court.
Professor Powell, last word, I guess, on risk of irreparable harm and urgency, as we heard South Africa argue yesterday. COGAT is said in Israel to be engaging in humanitarian efforts. On the 8th of December, the amount of fuel 2023 entering Gaza doubled. We've also heard about how Israel supplies water to Gaza. We were shown pictures of ambulances that were lined up ready to enter into Gaza. And so did Israel manage to convince the court, as they said, that the risk of irreparable harm is to them and that there's no urgency in this matter because their fight is not that intense anymore? I forget the words verbatim, but their fight is not that intense anymore.
I think on irreparable prejudice, one of the strongest points legally that Israel was able to make is, look, Hamas is not before the court, only we are. And we're claiming that there's a military conflict between ourselves and Hamas. Hamas is a non-state party. It can't be brought before the ICJ. And what South Africa is trying to get you to do is to stop one side from fighting, but the other side would be able to carry on, and that will cause us irreparable prejudice. So that was its argument on the danger to itself. On the danger to Palestinians, again, this is something the ICJ will need to consider, but I think the points that Mr. Levy made are pretty good, that a lot of these improvements have been fairly recent. And, you know, the whole thing began on the 7th of October with a siege. Water, electricity, everything cut off, and an intention a stated intention to destroy Gaza at the time. So it may be partly the effects of this court case that has allowed things to improve as much as they have. I couldn't help noticing, while the Israeli Council were talking about how wonderfully they're cooperating with the UN and the USA and Egypt and so on, that the UN itself, that its aid agencies frequently complained that Israel was making it impossible for them to work within the territory. So on a pure question of fact, I'm not sure how reassured I am. I think fact is one of the big issues here. You know, we had a huge part of Israel's argument being that actually everything we're doing is because Hamas is embedded and Hamas has booby-trapped houses, and this is actually all just Hamas blowing Gaza up. That's one of the things that I would like a court of law to consider. It's an argument that Israel has been making for a very long time, and I think we need the cold light of law to have a look at both sets of arguments, and the mere allegations made today by Israel, we didn't even see them in advance. I don't know what sources they're using for that. And the substantiated allegations, but nonetheless not yet tested by South Africa yesterday, do indicate that we've got an entire territory being wiped out, and we have got statements of genocidal intent. I hope that the court is prepared to continue this matter forward. Let me just add that Israel's legal defense on the question of whether there actually was a dispute was significant. And when it attacked the provisional measures, it came up with some important arguments. So if the ICJ does grant the provisional measures, I suspect they will be somewhat tailored and not what South Africa has asked for.
We'll have to wait for the court to deliver that in a couple of days, weeks, or even a month. Thank you very much to both our guests, Daniel Levy, political scientist and head of U.S. Middle East Project, and Cathleen Powell is the Associate Professor of Public Law at the University of Cape Town.